Hey everyone, welcome back to Infinite Podcast. I'm your host, ready to dive into something pretty hefty today, economics and its thrilling journey from the classroom all the way to Congress. Ever wonder why talking about the nation's debt feels like a roller coaster ride? Well, it boils down to some basic stuff, like debt to GDP ratios and fiscal policies. Simon, I think sometimes we skip the basics in school and end up misunderstanding how huge this is when these decisions are made at higher levels. What's your take on this gap in economic education affecting our handling of national debts?
Oh, Joe, you hit the nail right on the head. It's like trying to drive a car without knowing how to shift gears. If folks don't get the basics of economics in school, how can they understand what's happening when Congress talks about billions or trillions in debt? They're throwing around these massive numbers and fancy terms, and half the time I bet people are just nodding along thinking about what's for dinner. We need that foundation, man, or we'll keep spinning our wheels, wondering why things aren't getting better.
Absolutely, Simon. For starters, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio is soaring above 100%, which means the nation owes more than what it produces economically in a year. Now, that's like owing a whole year's salary. Fiscal policies are supposed to manage this by adjusting government spending and tax rates, but without clear understanding of these principles, people just see numbers. High school economics might touch on these topics, but does it stick? Nah, most forget it as soon as they toss their graduation cap. If we're not literate in these basics, how can we expect to critically analyze decisions made by those in power? Definitely a recipe for confusion, not improvement.
Yeah, that's a wild way to put it, like owing a whole year's salary. That definitely puts things into perspective. And you're spot on about school just brushing over these huge concepts. They teach it, we maybe remember for the test, and then poof, it's gone. But here's what I'm wondering, Joe. If we know this is such a big deal, why aren't changes being made in how economics is taught? Aren't there more engaging ways to make sure it sticks instead of just fading away after the final exam?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? It feels like sometimes the education system is more about passing exams than actual learning. I mean, think about it. Economics isn't just some dry textbook stuff. It affects every aspect of our lives, from the job market to what we pay for groceries. But all too often, it's taught in these abstract terms that don't relate to everyday life. Honestly, Simon, maybe it needs to be more hands-on. Imagine simulations or interactive games where students get to manage a budget or simulate economic crises and find solutions. Wouldn't that stick more than just memorizing graphs and definitions? We need to pivot how economics is delivered if we really want future voters to really understand, the stakes when policies are debated in Congress.
Dude, that's exactly it. Like this one time, this is going to sound a bit out there, but I was playing this online simulation game. One of those where you get to manage your own little virtual city. So there I am, trying to balance the budget without driving all my little virtual citizens into poverty or like letting the city crumble. And man, it was a wake-up call. I had to figure out how to invest in public services, set tax rates that weren't going to make everyone revolt, and somehow keep the city running smoothly. It was crazy stressful, but super enlightening. It made me think, wow, this is just a game, but it's kind of what policymakers deal with on a mega scale. If we had stuff like that in school, don't you think more people would have a clue about what's going on when they hear about fiscal policies and national debt? Like, actually connect it to real life decisions instead of just zoning out.
Oh man, that's such a killer idea. I mean, using a game like that, that is next level stuff. Like, you're not just cramming for a test, you're living the experience. It's one thing to read about fiscal policies and budget management, and a whole other to actually navigate them under pressure, even if it's virtual. This should totally be integrated into education, right? If kids, and hey, even adults, could play through those scenarios, they'd get a real sense of the trade-offs and challenges leaders face with every economic decision. Like, not gonna lie, but that sounds way more engaging than traditional lecturing. Makes you wonder why more classrooms aren't adopting this method to teach something as critical as economics, especially given how deeply it impacts governmental decisions and our overall quality of life.
Totally, Joe. Imagine election debates where voters are throwing in questions based on their simulation game experiences. Sir, in level 5 of Econocity, I managed to lower unemployment and balance the budget. How come you can't do that in real life? Ha! It totally changed the game. Literally.
Haha, that's a fantastic point, Simon. Can you imagine the level of accountability? Politicians would need to up their game massively. But here's something I'm curious about. Do you think there's a risk that people might oversimplify real-world problems, like assuming what works in Econocity is directly applicable to real-life economics without considering the complex layers and unpredictable elements of actual governance? What's your take on that, man?
Yeah, Joe, that's a super valid point. There's definitely a risk of oversimplifying stuff. Like in a game, you can reset, no real harm done. But in real life, not so much. Decisions have deep and lasting impacts on like millions of people. The variables are endless: political climates, global economics, social issues. It's a lot. So while these games can be awesome for grasping basic concepts and engaging with the material, we got to remember it's a simplified model. It's like training wheels. Great for learning, but eventually, you need to ride without them. That doesn't mean what you learn isn't valuable, but we got to understand the difference between theoretical or simulated scenarios and the messy reality of actual governance, you know?
Totally get where you're coming from, Simon. But on the flip side, while acknowledging that simulations can oversimplify things, it's also worth noting that they might actually prepare people for real-world complexity better than traditional methods. These games force users to think strategically about resources and consequences, which is crucial, right? And here's why I think that viewpoint holds water. Taking theory into a simulated practical application helps cement learning. Research shows that active learning scenarios improve comprehension and retention of complex subjects. So, while sure, no model or simulation can capture every nuance of economic policy, engaging with concepts in a dynamic and interactive way could still better equip folks to understand and question real-world economic policies more effectively. Don't you think? It gives them a groundwork to build on, even if it's not the whole picture.
Oh, yeah, Joe, I see what you're saying. Like using those simulations is not just about playing a game, it's more like stepping into the shoes of decision makers. It sort of lays down the groundwork, doesn't it? Even if it's not the complete picture, it definitely adds layers to someone's understanding. And man, thinking about it, using these tools in an educational setting is kind of eye-opening for students and, well, anyone really. If folks can practice these scenarios where they manage economy-sized problems, maybe, just maybe, they could appreciate the complexity of what happens in Congress or in real-world economic crises a bit better. Isn't that crucial for solving big issues like the debt crisis? It's all connected, right?
Absolutely, Simon. And think about this. What if these simulations could be updated in real time with actual economic data and trends? It'd be like a continuous live lesson on economics tailored to current events. Bringing that level of immediacy could deepen understanding and spark even more engaging conversations about how best to tackle something as monumental as the debt crisis. Now that would definitely keep everyone on their toes, huh?
Oh, speaking of staying on our toes and looking at real-time updates, it kind of makes me think about how we're not just dealing with this stuff for the first time ever. Uh, History is jam-packed with times where nations clawed their way out of massive debts, like post-World War scenarios or during the Great Depression. Joe, diving into that might give us some wild insights into what worked back then and what could actually be repurposed for today's economic mess. What do you think?
Yeah, Simon, diving into history is definitely a solid move. It's like looking through an old playbook to find strategies that scored big in the past, right? For instance, post World War II, many countries were in rubble economically and literally, and they had to rebuild from scratch. Things like the Marshall Plan come to mind, where massive aid helped Europe get back on its feet. Now I'm thinking, could a modern version of that kind of support be what we need to tackle today's debt challenges? Do you think something that's structured could work now with all the different economic variables we have today?
Uh, you know, that's a fascinating thought, Joe. Like the Marshall Plan, huge, bold, kind of like a big splash of cold water to wake up the economy. But thinking about today's world, it's kind of tricky, right? The scale and context have shifted so much. I mean, back then economies were more isolated, which made massive injections of aid more straightforward. But now with globalization, any big economic move in one country ripples across the globe. So, while I totally get the appeal of throwing that historical Hail Mary pass, today's game requires more. What do you call it? Nuanced plays. And hey, let's not forget how those post war strategies also came with their own set of problems, like inflation or dependence on foreign aid. Gotta be cautious not to romanticize them too much without considering how those consequences would play out in our current scenario, don't you think?
Absolutely, Simon. It's like you're saying the context has changed so much that even though those big moves worked back then, today's economic landscape is way more intertwined globally. It's tricky to just scoop up past solutions without adapting them to how interconnected things are now. And makes me think, given all that complexity with globalization and potential unwanted side effects like inflation, what kind of strategy could we actually put forward? Like, do you see a contemporary twist on any old school economic recovery tactic that might be more on point for today's issues? What's your take on tweaking these old methods to better fit our current world situation?
Yeah, Joe. Tweaking those old school tactics for today's vibe sounds about as easy as teaching my grandma to text, right? But seriously, thinking about how everything is so linked together nowadays, maybe we need more of a tech savvy approach, like perhaps taking cues from the post Great Depression recovery, where there was a ton of focus on public works, boost jobs and infrastructure at the same time. But here's the modern twist. What if we pump that investment into green technologies or digital infrastructure? It's kind of like hitting two birds with one stone, getting economic boost and setting up for future tech advances. So it's not just about pumping money in, it's more strategic, considering long term impacts rather than just plastering over current issues. Think that could stick, or is it too out there?
Oh, that's not out there at all, Simon. It's actually genius. Going green and digital could be our silver bullet strategy, you know? Like, we're not just talking about a comeback, we're setting up the stage for sustainable growth. Gives a whole new meaning to forward thinking economics.
Yeah, Joe, that sounds super progressive and all, but let's pump the brakes for a sec. Like diving headfirst into green tech and digital infrastructure. It's bold, sure, but there are serious considerations here. One biggie is the upfront cost, right? These technologies ain't cheap, and pivoting an entire economy towards them requires a massive initial investment. Like historically, post crisis recoveries that worked, think post World War II, they often had some sort of external financial support, like the Marshall Plan. And there another thing, displacement. As we shift from traditional industries to these new sectors, what happens to all those jobs in the old sectors? Not everyone can just switch from, say, manufacturing to coding or solar panel installation overnight. That might actually deepen economic disparities instead of fixing them. So, while I get why this forward thinking approach is appealing, we got to weigh those risks too. It could be more complicated than it looks on paper, you know?
You're spot on about those challenges, Simon. It sort of reminds me of this little story. Back when I was just starting out in radio, our whole station got a huge tech upgrade, right? All the old analog equipment out, and in came the sleek digital stuff. Sounds great on the surface, but here's the catch. Not all of us knew how to work the new system. kind of like what you're saying with job displacement. So there I was, this young guy thinking I was hot stuff because I knew how to edit tape, and suddenly it's all waveforms and software. Like overnight, my skills felt kind of old school. It took time and some serious training to get everyone up to speed. Some folks, they struggled more than others. That sort of transformation, while inevitable, really put a spotlight on why just moving forward isn't always enough without considering how it impacts everything. Like, definitely gave me an appreciation for those broader economic shifts we're talking about, where big changes might cost at the outset and shake things up significantly before the real benefits start to show.
Yeah, Joe. And it's wild to think about how every big shift, be it in a radio station or an entire economy, is kind of like throwing a rock into a pond. You get those ripples. And speaking of shaking things up, ever wonder what would happen if we treated economics like a massive multiplayer online game? Everybody gets to vote on the next big economic move, kind of crowdsourcing crisis management.
Oh man, Simon, twist that into an episode. Boom! Imagine tuning in to see which way the crowd swings on life-changing financial decisions. It's like economic reality TV meets democracy. What a wild ride that would be.
Oh, and speaking of crowdsourcing, right? Thinking about it more, historical examples sometimes felt like a single person or a small group made all the decisions. But today, with technology and information at everyone's fingertips, engaging more minds could perhaps provide a more holistic approach to tackling big problems like national debt. Like imagine if during the Great Depression, regular people had a say in the New Deal policies through instant polling or something. Not only would it bring new perspectives into play, but it might also increase buy-in from the general populace because they're directly involved, promoting transparency and maybe even accelerating recovery in ways old strategies couldn't. And that might just be what we need to implement those modified tactics from history adequately, you know?
Absolutely, Simon. Blending historical strategies with modern tech to democratize economic decisions could really change the game. It makes you wonder what other lessons we can pull from the past and adapt using today's tools for even better results. Man, there's definitely more to explore there.
Speaking of pulling lessons from the past, imagine if we could get a bunch of ex-presidents together to hash out America's whopping debt. Like, picture Lincoln, Reagan, and Obama throwing down in a no-holds-barred, cage-match-style debate over how they handled the national checkbook. That would sort of be like combing super serious fiscal talk with an episode of a comedy roast, huh? Let's dive into that. What do you think Reagan would crack wise about first?
Oh man, Reagan. He'd probably start off with something like, well, there you go again, pointing right at Obama and Lincoln, joking about how every time they'd think they're reducing the debt, it just springs back up taller than a California redwood. Reagan was all about those snappy one-liners, mixed with his charm, even when tackling heavy topics like economic policies. I can totally see him trying to lighten the mood, but also sneaking in real critiques about overspending or mismanagement, like adding a quip about Star Wars, not the movie, but his strategic defense initiative, and connecting it to how sometimes big spending is about playing the long game, huh? And then let's think about Lincoln. He'd probably retort with something super witty yet historical, mentioning how he managed to fund the Civil War without so many modern financial tools. Maybe something like, back in my day, we didn't have these fancy treasury bonds. We fought wars with sheer grit and a bit of good luck, drawing a parallel to today's fiscal challenges, but keeping it light. What do you think Obama would throw into the mix after hearing those two?
Oh, Obama would definitely jump in with his smooth talk and cool demeanor, saying something like, "Look, guys, at least I didn't leave such a tab that historians will debate it for centuries. Plus, healthcare costs, am I right?" And then he'd probably remind them about the importance of investing in the future, even if it means dealing with some debt now. It'd turn into this hilarious yet insightful spar over bucks and policies. What's the audience saying about who'd win this presidential roast-off, Joe?
Man, a presidential roast-off about national debt? That's pure gold. Just picture it. Lincoln with his top hat and humor, Reagan with those Hollywood zingers, and Obama with that cool charisma, all trying to one-up each other on fiscal policies. Our audience would eat this up, right? Mixing history with humor is kind of like having your cake and eating it too. Who do they think would drop the best punchline, or should I say policy line?
Yeah. If we're talking dropping the best line here, my money's on Reagan. I mean, the guy had a knack for charming anyone with just a sentence or two. Sprinkle in his old Hollywood flair, and bam, you've got memorable sound bites that stick. But then thinking about like Obama's ability to connect through his patience and measured responses, he could easily swing in with some insightful quip that not just lands, but also resonates on a deeper level. Lincoln, though, he's kind of the dark horse in this roast-off. His lines might be more old school, but they pack a punch with their mix of wit and wisdom from a totally different era. It's a tough call. What do you think, Joe? Who held their ground best in our comedic debt debate here?
Man, that's a tough one. Like, each of these guys brings something different to the table, right? Reagan with his charm, Obama's cool logic, and Lincoln's wise cracks. I'd have to say it's close, but Reagan might edge out just for the style points. So, Simon, who do you think would have the audience more on board with their approach? Like, considering our blend of humor and serious policy talk here, who's resonating more, do you think?
Well, Joe, while Reagan's style is totally killer in the charm department, I'd argue that Obama might actually grab more of our audience with his approach. Like, considering he dealt with the modern complexities of the national debt during a major recession, right? His frame of reference is something a lot of our listeners can directly relate to. It's current and still impactful. And Obama uses those cool-headed explanations mixed with just the right amount of humor to make big issues seem more manageable or palatable. His way digs into the nitty-gritty of policy, but keeps it light enough that you don't feel like you're just getting lectured. That combo can really resonate with folks who want to understand these massive topics without feeling overwhelmed. But then again, each prez brings something unique to this wildly serious yet laugh-packed debate. Huh?
Totally, Simon. It's that relatability factor with Obama. He speaks to the issues like he's having a conversation over coffee, not just throwing stats at you from a podium. That definitely clicks better with folks today who crave authenticity and clarity without the political fluff. Each guy's got his charm, but connecting those old school strategies with today's problems in ways people can actually grasp, that's where you light up minds and keep them tuned in for more. My man.
For sure, Joe. Like when you take these big old issues and spin them with a bit of humor and charm from folks like Reagan, Lincoln, and Obama, it just shows there are endless angles to explore. Tackling the giant beast that is America's debt without losing your mind just might be doable if we keep mixing the wisdom of the past with today's quick wit. So, what wacky historical combo should we throw into the mix next time to unravel another modern mess?
Oh, Simon, speaking of mixing wisdom and wit to tackle huge issues, it really makes you wonder about the aftermath once we finally get a handle on this massive debt. Like, what's next? Do we hit a period of doom with tough times stretching out? Or is there a boom on the horizon where things just start looking up with innovations and market expansions? Let's dive into some expert opinions on these possible futures post-debt resolution. What are you thinking could happen?
Well, Joe, when experts start yapping about this sort of stuff, you get a real mixed bag of predictions, right? Like, on one end, you've got the doomsayers. They're talking about how if we don't get a grasp on this debt, we could be looking at prolonged economic blues, like less investment in new tech, cuts in public spending, which could lead to a slower economy overall. But then, flip to the sunshine side, and you have optimists who are all like, hey, handle this debt right, and boom, we're ushering in an era filled with tech innovations and robust market expansions. So while some folks see a potential doom scenario where we lose global credibility and face serious financial constraints, others totally picture a more hopeful prospect where handling our debts sparks economic growth, boosts employment, and fuels public trust in financial management. It's really about balancing those fears with foresights, huh? How much weight do you think we should give to each side of that coin?
It's tricky, Simon. Weighing these expert views is kind of like balancing on a tightrope. On one side, if we lean too hard into the doom predictions, focusing purely on the negatives like economic stagnation and losing global trust, it might paralyze decision makers with fear, right? That could stall out proactive solutions, which are crucial for climbing out of this hole. But then, add in the boom perspective where things look pretty rosy. Experts suggesting that smart debt management could lead us into a surge of technological advancements, market growth, and overall economic health. This angle offers a lot more hope and drives innovation by imagining what could go right instead of dwelling on what might go wrong. So, giving equal weight to both views is key because it keeps our strategies balanced between caution and optimism. Equals, which really is vital when steering such a big ship as a national economy. But tell me, Simon, how do schools of thought like these affect public sentiment and policymaking in your view?
Oh, Joe, it's like a seesaw at the playground, right? If public sentiment swings too far pessimistic, policymakers might clamp down hard on spending to avoid debt, stifling growth. But if everyone's too optimistic, we might overspend, thinking everything's dandy and end up in deeper water. Keeping everyone balanced on that seesaw with a clear eye on both potential futures, that's what can drive policies that are innovative yet prudent.
Totally, Simon. It's like juggling fireballs and ice cubes. Get it wrong, and it's a mess. Nail it, and it's a spectacular show. That fine balance could indeed be the secret sauce for thriving in the tightrope walk of economic policies. What's our next move on this roller coaster, huh?
Yeah, Joe, it's definitely a roller coaster with all these ups and downs. Working that balance is kind of like being the calm pilot in a storm, right? So, considering all this talk about potential future scenarios, boom or doom, what do you think are some actionable steps like policymakers should start working on now to steer us towards those more optimistic outcomes?
Well, Simon, for starters, focusing on long-term investments in technology and infrastructure might be key. Like if policymakers can direct funds into areas that not only provide immediate relief, but also promise sustainable growth, think renewable energy, tech education, and digital infrastructure, that could seriously set us up for a boom. And ensuring there's transparent communication about where the money goes and how it's expected to spark growth is critical, right? That way, people are more likely to trust that their government isn't just throwing money at problems, but actually investing in their future. Plus, tweaking tax policies to encourage innovation without putting too much strain on the taxpayers or businesses could also help tilt us toward a more optimistic scenario. What do you think of these strategies, Simon?
Those are solid points you've got there, Joe, like really thoughtful. But let's play devil's advocate for a sec. What about the potential downsides of these long-term investments? I mean, all this spending on tech and infrastructure sounds super promising, right? But it also comes with big risks. Like, what if the expected growth takes longer than anticipated or fails to meet the projections? Plus, transparency and tweaking tax policies sound great on paper, but in practice, they often get snarled up in political tangles, which could slow down the whole process. So, while aiming for the boom by pushing innovation sounds phenomenal, aren't we risking quite a bit by putting many eggs in one rather speculative basket? How do we make sure this doesn't just turn into another idealistic plan that never gets off the ground because of, political infighting or market unpredictability?
Absolutely, Simon. Those are legit concerns, man. Betting big on tech and restructuring policies does carry a risk, especially with slow burn results and political hurdles. It's all about calculated risks and backup strategies to buffer against potential fallbacks or delays. Guess we'll need another deep dive into how these dynamics play out in real-time scenarios, keeping our finger on the pulse of both policy developments and market reactions, huh? What's your take on exploring more about minimizing these risks in a future chat?
Oh man, Joe, diving into debt forgiveness programs around the globe sounds like uncovering hidden treasures for countries drowning in debt seas. Let's set sail and see what gems we can uncover in this financial adventure. What's the scoop on these programs?
Oh, dude, you're spot on. It's like we're Indiana Jones in the financial jungle. Debt forgiveness programs are basically these life rafts thrown out to countries sinking under heavy debts. Organizations like the IMF and World Bank roll out these initiatives to lighten the load, hoping to stabilize global markets and rev up economic growth. It's all about giving nations a fresh start by wiping the slate clean or restructuring what they owe. Pretty epic, right? Let's dig into how these programs actually work and who gets to benefit from them.
Totally epic, Joe. So, who actually qualifies for these big deal programs? Are there specific criteria that countries need to meet to get this kind of financial do-over? And I'm kind of curious, man, how does wiping the debt clean impact a nation's economy in the long run?
Oh man, Simon, that's a great point. So look, countries usually need to meet certain economic conditions or thresholds to qualify for this debt relief. It's not just anyone who can jump in and get a bailout. There are strict criteria like poverty levels, current debt sustainability, and sometimes policy commitments to ensure they don't end up back in the same situation. And as for the impact, clearing up the books can really give these economies breathing room to grow, invest in public services, and stabilize. But it's crucial, man. They got to use that fresh start wisely to avoid falling right back into debt.
Joe, it's like hitting the reset button, huh? But there's that big if. If they use the second chance wisely, makes you wonder what's in place to make sure they don't slip back into the debt pit.
Yeah, Simon, hitting that reset button comes with some serious safeguards to prevent a slide back into the debt pit. Like when these countries get debt forgiveness, they're often tied to structural reforms, right? It's like they have to agree to improve their governance, cut corruption, and boost economic efficiency as part of the deal. Plus, there's usually ongoing monitoring by those major players. Think IMF or World Bank to make sure everything's on track and the money's being used as it should. It helps keep the brakes on spending and encourages responsible financial planning. Really crucial stuff for making sure it's not just a temporary fix, but a real long-term solution, you know?
Yeah, Joe, that makes sense. So, they're not just getting a free pass, they're getting a whole playbook on how to turn their economies around with these big brothers, like IMF and World Bank, watching over their shoulders. Huh? Does this scrutiny from big organizations really encourage countries to keep up with those reforms? Or does it feel more like they're just ticking boxes to please the monitors? What's your take on how genuine these efforts are?
Oh, dude, Simon, that's a sharp question. This dynamic can definitely feel like a double-edged sword, right? On one hand, these international bodies provide expertise and oversight, which can be vital for countries lacking in certain administrative capacities. They help lay down structures and processes that might not be in place otherwise. But there's the other edge. Some critics argue it sometimes ends up more about compliance to external standards rather than genuine internal reform. Like countries might push through changes just to meet the necessary checkboxes without fully integrating these reforms into their normal operations. Here's the thing, though. The effectiveness often varies big time depending on each country's specific context and how committed their local leaders are to actual change, not just superficial tweaks. Some countries leverage this opportunity brilliantly, translating the reforms and support into real economic advancements and better governance. It's all about whether the changes take root in the local soil, you know?
Oh, totally, Joe. It's like each country's got to plant those reforms and actually nurture them, not just stick them in the ground and hope they grow. It makes you wonder how many have managed to truly blossom under these programs and which ones might still be just scratching at the surface. There's a whole world of stories out there about turning those opportunities into real success or missing the mark. Maybe that's something we can dive deeper into next time.
Absolutely, Simon. And speaking of turning those opportunities into real success or missing the mark, it kind of nudges us towards another crucial angle, the ethics of all this debt canceling. Like, it's a massive relief for some, but also sparks intense debates about fairness and moral responsibility, you know? Take the case of Greece during the Eurozone crisis. Massive controversy over ethical versus financial obligations. How do we strike that balance between national interests and international duties, huh? What's your take on the moral side of these economic moves?
Yeah, Joe, that's a real brain teaser. Like, on one hand, wiping out debt can feel like a no brainer for countries under crushing financial weights, gives them a fresh start, right? But then you think about the lenders and other stakeholders. It's not just about the money, it's their trust and investment too. Where do we draw the line between helping out and handouts? And man, talking about Greece, what a story. They were in deep waters, economically speaking. And the debate was kind of fiery. Tons of people said, forgive the debt, they need room to breathe. But others argued, could that set a dangerous precedent? Like, if we say it's cool for Greece, what stops other countries from lining up for the same deal without taking serious strides in fixing their own issues? It's like every decision in this arena is a bit of a tightrope walk between national revival and responsible global citizenship. What's fair game here?
Exactly, Simon. It's like you really nailed the complexity here. Every time I think about these situations, like with Greece and the potential fallout, I get this real tug of war feeling inside. On one side, there's undeniable human empathy, right? You see countries struggling, people suffering, and your first instinct is to help out, alleviate that pain. But then there's that hard-hitting reality of fairness and responsibility. It's kind of a heavy load thinking about maintaining trust among nations while trying to do the right thing for the common good. Can we just wipe slates clean without incentivizing maybe bad behavior or negligence on financial reforms? And let's not forget the individuals, the everyday folks whose lives hang in the balance. It's not only an abstract macroeconomic debate, it's about real people's futures. It gets tough, man, deciding what's truly fair game here. What feels right morally might be complex economically, and vice versa. How do we find that middle ground without tipping over, huh?
Oh, dude, it's like we're spinning plates while standing on a tightrope. Balancing human empathy and financial realities, it's going to take some serious skill to not let anything crash. What if we looked into how different countries handled these dilemmas? Could give us some wild insights or maybe even solutions for this balancing act, huh?
Oh, that's a wicked idea, Simon. Diving into different countries' playbooks could totally unravel some bold moves or missteps worth learning from. Whether it's a crash or a smooth landing, there's definitely a lesson tucked in there somewhere. Let's explore that next, huh?
Yeah, Joe, flipping the script a bit here. Like, there's also legit concern about just canceling debts outright. Some critics argue that it might undermine fiscal responsibility. Like, if debts are forgiven too easily or too often, countries might feel less pressure to manage their finances prudently. It's like if every time I overspend my budget at home and someone just clears my credit card bill, what's stopping me from splurging again? And there's the whole fairness angle to consider. Lenders, they offered funds under certain terms, right? Completely wiping away those debts can seem kind of unjust to them, makes future lenders wary. Or they might hike up interest rates because they perceive higher risks in lending to nations that had their debts forgiven before. So it sets this precarious kind of precedent. Plus, economically speaking, it could disrupt the financial market dynamics. Stability is key, man, for global economic health, and knowing that agreements will be honored is part of that stability. So, as much as we empathize with struggling nations, the broader implications of debt forgiveness are pretty layered and worth considering carefully. It's not just about today's relief, but tomorrow's repercussions too.
Man, Simon, you just hit a major point. This whole idea of moral hazard is super important to think about. Like if countries know they might get bailed out from their debts down the line, what's stopping them from taking risky or unsustainable financial paths? It's almost like telling someone there's no real consequence to risky behavior because there's always going to be a safety net. And then the fairness to lenders, you're so right. Those guys are kind of banking on those agreements being upheld. Wiping debt off without solid reasons can throw trust out the window and might make lenders think twice in the future. Like, they could start charging crazy interest rates to compensate for that increased risk perception. This stuff isn't just numbers on a page, it shapes how countries operate in the global market, you know? Seriously, thinking through both the immediate benefits and those long-term implications is crucial. What do you think we'll see going forward, given all these challenges?
Oh man, Joe, it's like playing economic Jenga. Pull out the wrong block and everything could topple. Moving forward, it's going to be a wild ride watching how these nations navigate this minefield. Will they tiptoe carefully or just stomp through?
Ha, exactly. It's like they're either going to defuse the bomb or go out with a bang. Which move do you think's more likely in the current global climate?
Well, Joe, that's like the $1 million question, right? Given how tense things are globally, I'm kind of leaning towards thinking we'll see both. Some countries might just charge ahead boldly, risks and all, maybe because they feel there's not much more to lose. Others might tread super carefully, trying to balance every step because they know how high the stakes are. But then again, it's a bit of a guessing game with so many international players throwing their strategies into the ring. Uh, what do you reckon, man? Do you think most will go for the big risky moves or play it safe and slow?
Man, Simon, it's going to be intriguing to watch this unfold. Each country's approach could change the game entirely. I guess only time will tell whether they'll risk the bold moves or stick to the safer paths. Uh, what other impacts do you think these choices might have on global economics and political relations down the line?
Yeah, Joe, diving into how these countries play it, bold or safe, leads us to another fascinating twist in the debt saga. Have you heard about some of the unusual debt relief methods popping up around the globe? Like, beyond your standard forgiveness or restructuring, some places are getting really creative to handle their dues. For instance, there's this thing called debt for nature, swaps, a totally out-of-the-box concept where a country's debt is reduced in exchange for commitments to environmental protection. Plus, drifting back through time, we used to have these ancient debt jubilees where all debts were wiped clean as part of festival celebrations. Imagine the party vibes when everyone's ledger hits zero. What do you think about these unconventional methods, huh?
Oh man, those are some wild ideas. Like debt for nature swaps sound like something out of a futuristic novel, huh? Nature gets a lifeline and a country lightens its financial load. A win-win in my book. And ha, the whole ancient debt jubilee thing? Talk about the ultimate reset button. Imagine hitting that every few years. Credit score? Never heard of her. But seriously, it kind of makes you appreciate the creativity when tackling such heavy issues. Mixing environmental preservation with economic solutions is kind of clever. Maybe it's not just about clearing debts, but also paving the way for a greener future. What's next? Debt for pizza deals. I'd get behind that movement.
Joe, debt for pizza might just revolutionize our whole take on economics, man. But for real, while mixing up debt relief with environmental efforts sounds super modern and cool, I gotta wonder, like, how sustainable these quirky methods are long term. It's one thing to cut down debt by saving the rainforest, which is, awesome, but it's kind of niche, don't you think? And about those debt jubilees, total reset sounds great in theory, right? But, could it backfire by making people think they can just rack up debts and wait for the next jubilee? Kind of risky if everyone starts playing that waiting game. Plus, not every country can just say, all right, let's wipe the slate clean without some serious economic backlash. What do you think? Is there a line where creative becomes a little too creative?
Oh, totally, Simon. It's like balancing on the edge of innovation and chaos. Pushing the envelope could really shake things up, but where do we draw the line before it all starts to unravel? What if we flip this whole thing, like countries offering crazy incentives for responsible financial behavior instead of just bailouts? Could that twist keep everyone on their toes?
Yeah, Joe, flipping it around like that, rewarding good behavior instead of just cleaning up messes, uh, that could seriously spice things up. It's like instead of waiting for folks to trip into debt before throwing them a lifeline, we incentivize staying out of it from the get-go. Could be more sustainable in the long run, right? Imagine something like lower interest rates or financial bonuses for countries that keep their budget tight and transparent. That kind of approach might motivate better economic practices ahead of time, not just when the waters are already rising. What do you think? Is there potential there, or does it sound like too much wishful thinking?
Yeah, Simon, like incentivizing good behavior up front. It's a radical shift, but it's so dang promising. It might instill some solid habits early on rather than having governments playing catch up when things get messy. Setting up rewards for diligence could make a major difference. And, comparing it to personal finance, like getting lower interest rates for good credit scores, it just makes sense on a larger scale, too. Do you think, though, that countries would jump at this kind of approach, or would there be resistance to changing the old ways? What's your take on how achievable this is?
Oh man, Joe, switching up old habits in global finance? It's like trying to teach a cat to fetch. A lot of staring and confusion, and probably not much fetching. But hey, if countries start biting at this new system, maybe we'd see some world leaders out there hustling for those fiscal fitness badges instead of just chilling in the debt hammock.
Spot on, Simon. If we drill down into these unusual debt relief methods like the debt for nature swaps, there's more to unpack. Like, think about it. These programs don't just cut down debt, they also promote long-term commitments to sustainability. It's not just a quick fix, but a strategic play that benefits environmental and financial health simultaneously. And when you talk about this prevention over cure model with incentives for good financial behavior, it could literally reshape how nations handle their finances from the top down, foster transparency, and avoiding economic pitfalls before they even happen. So yeah, there's a real potential for setting a global example. But then again, transitioning to such systems would be quite the undertaking, right? With so many layers of government and policy worldwide, implementing such sweeping changes sounds like, well, a massive challenge.
You're right, Joe. Implementing global scale changes, it's a colossal task. Like, aren't we often seeing tons of red tape and slow moving policy shifts? Each country has its own political landscape and priorities, so synchronizing something as big as financial incentives for good behavior, it's complicated, man. And while these innovative solutions like debt for nature are super clever and impactful, scaling them globally could stir up a storm. How do countries with different environmental agendas work it out? Like transitioning to this sort of strategy across the board, that's going to need some serious cooperation and maybe even, rethinking international law or policies. It's not just flipping a switch, it's rewiring the whole system. What's your gut feeling, Joe? Are we looking at a future where this is norm, or is it too utopian to expect such unity and motivation globally?
Oh man, Simon, diving deep here. Reflecting on this, the leap to seeing these debt relief methods as normative globally, it is quite utopian in the current setup. But on that note, let's think about other unique cases making waves. For instance, there are also debt for education deals gaining traction, where debt relief is exchanged for local investments in education systems. It's kind of a brainy approach to slicing down debt while boosting societal foundations. And, touching back on assigned contexts, Poland and Denmark have dabbled in innovations such as converting old foreign debts into funds specifically for homegrown projects or social initiatives. It gives the debt payback a tangible benefit right back into the national community. To wrap your head around system changes and international cooperation, such ideas initially sound off the charts optimistic, but they lay genuine groundwork for sustainable models we can all look towards. Does that light a hopeful torch at the end of this complex tunnel, or what?
Oh, totally, Joe. It's like turning financial lemons into a kick ass lemonade stand that benefits everyone. If debt can build schools and fund local projects instead of just vanishing into thin air, we're cooking with some seriously spices here. What a game changer that could be, right?
Absolutely, Simon. Speaking of game changers, it kind of makes you think about where we're headed in the future with managing debt. Let's dial up the imagination, taking cues from movies like Margin Call or books like The Big Short. What could be some wild, potentially effective approaches to national debt management that haven't been tried yet? How might those fictional scenarios spark real-world strategies?
Ah, diving into those stories, Joe, like The Big Short, gives us a peek into these super gutsy moves and out of the box thinking, right? Now, imagine if we took that creative vibe and applied it to dealing with national debts. How about a concept where every transaction involving new public spending is mirrored by an equal investment in debt reduction? Or maybe even using AI models to predict and prevent future financial crises before they blow up. These ideas might sound a bit sci fi now, but given how life seems to be catching up with fiction lately, uh, who's to say what's too wild? The key could be blending these imaginative frameworks with ground level realities. I mean, learning from emergencies depicted in media might help governments adapt and, create buffer systems to handle economic shocks better. What do you think? Are any of these ideas just too out there? Or could they actually shape some practical policies?
For those just tuning in, we're getting creative here on Infinite Podcast, discussing some futuristic twists on managing national debts. We've been diving into how out-of-the-box ideas from movies like Margin Call or books like The Big Short, where big risks and innovative thinking pay off, might inspire real-world economic strategies. We're chatting about wild concepts, like linking every new public expense with an investment in debt reduction, or even using AI to forecast and dodge financial meltdowns before they happen. Sounds a bit sci-fi, right? But hey, the line between fiction and reality is getting blurrier these days. So who knows? These ambitious ideas could potentially shape how we tackle national debt issues moving forward, making systems more resilient against economic shocks and stuff. Keep sticking with us as we explore if these imaginative solutions could one day become practical policies.
Absolutely, Joe. And imagine this. What if we had a global debt games, kind of like the Olympics, where countries compete in economic challenges to shave down their debts? Bit wacky, sure, but hey, why not entertain all angles when the stakes are sky high, right?
Simon, that's a wild ride of an idea, my man. A global debt games. Just think about the possibilities. Countries going head to head in creative and strategic economic challenges to cut down their debts. It's bonkers, but also kind of brilliant. I mean, it could turn fiscal responsibility into a competitive sport, and there'd be this whole new level of engagement with economics. Don't you think something as spectacle-driven as that could, make the general public more aware and even interested in national finance policies? Just imagine the crowds tuning in. What do you think? Could gamifying debt management catch on, or is it just too out there?
Joe, gamifying debt management, honestly, it's not as far out as it sounds. I mean, think about it. Making a spectacle like the debt games could totally transform public interest in what's usually seen as drab economic policy. By turning fiscal challenges into something as gripping as sports, people might start paying attention, and awareness is big. But there's this practical side too, right? Could be messy, figuring out fair play and equitable rules for all countries, given their varying economic conditions. Plus, keeping the focus more on genuine solutions rather than just winning the game, that's crucial to keep it from turning into just another reality show. However, if done right, injecting that level of competition and visibility could spur innovation and compliance alike, bringing some serious heat to managing national debts creatively. What do you think, Joe? Is the juice worth the squeeze here?
Yeah, Simon, the juice might just be worth the squeeze if we nail the execution part. But here's where I chuck a bit of cold water on it. While the debt games idea is super engaging, right? The risk is it could oversimplify some mega complex economic issues. Like reducing national debt isn't just about quick fixes or scoring points. It's tangled up in long-term policies, political stability, and global economic shifts. So turning it into a competition could possibly sideline the deep, nuanced work needed to really, handle these financial beasts. Plus, imagine the pressure on countries already struggling economically. Could this spotlight make things worse for them instead of better? But then again, I get where you're coming from. Mixing awareness with a bit of fun could indeed light a fire under the necessary people to take action. Maybe the trick is finding a balance, huh? Keeping the competitive spirit alive, but anchored deeply in real substantive economic reform. What's your take, Simon? Can we strike that balance, or are we dreaming too big here?
Oh, definitely dreaming big, Joe. But hey, since when has aiming too high been a bad thing? Might just be the wild card that shuffles the deck and brings out some long overdue changes. Let's keep that creative juice flowing.
Right on, Simon. Dreaming big, it's what stirs things up when the mundane gets too constrictive. So let me throw another angle at this. When we envision future models for debt management, thinking radically could lead to breakthroughs that traditional approaches might miss. Merging tech with finance, like using blockchain to track and manage public spending transparently, or AI-driven algorithms predicting economic downturns, could revolutionize accountability and foresight in financial policies. It's like harnessing the best of technology, not just for efficiency, but for stronger, more robust economic health globally. And while these ideas may seem fresh out of a sci-fi plot, they're rooted in viable technologies available today. So, as crazy as some proposals might sound, even our debt games concept, they spotlight the need for innovative thinking in tackling such deep-seated problems. What do you think, Simon? Could this techno-forward approach be what pulls us into a new era of financial strategy? Or is there a risk of us getting lost in the glitz of tech without enough tangible outcomes?
Oh, Joe, diving into tech like that could either be a game changer or just another shiny object syndrome, huh? It's like swinging between creating a Tony Stark style financial utopia and accidentally setting up a complicated mess no one really gets. Let's hope for more Iron Man and less Ultron, right? What's the next groundbreaking idea lurking around the corner?
Absolutely, Simon. Navigating these tech-infused waters carefully is key. Speaking of solutions and looking at success stories, it kind of ties back to how some countries have managed to pull themselves out of serious financial turmoil. Take Iceland after the 2008 crisis, or Argentina following their 2001 default. Both nations faced what you could call a debt crisis, an overwhelming situation where they couldn't keep up with their national debts, damaging their economies severely. But they didn't just return to stability, they came back stronger in many ways. Let's unpack how these countries like Iceland and Argentina turned their hardcore crises into comebacks. What do you think were the main ingredients for their recipe of resurgence?
Yeah, Joe, looking at Iceland and Argentina, it's like they hit the reset button in an epic way. For starters, Iceland let its banks fail instead of bailing them out, which sounds pretty wild, right? But it turned out to be a smart move because it cleared their economic slate quicker. Plus, they implemented stringent capital controls, keeping money inside the country to stabilize the economy. That's kind of like putting all your toys back in the toy box to make sure nothing goes missing. And Argentina, on the other hand, they restructured their debt, extending payment terms and reducing the burden, which is like stretching out your chores over the week so you don't get overwhelmed on Sunday, huh? Both cases show how crucial flexibility and tailored strategies are for bouncing back. It makes me wonder, are there universal strategies that just always work, or does each country need to cook up its own special recipe based on local ingredients? Or issues, I should say. What do you think, Joe?
Definitely some food for thought there, Simon. You've highlighted a couple of successful strategies with Iceland and Argentina, but I think it's kind of crucial to say that there's no one-size-fits-all solution here. Each country does indeed have to cook up its own recipe for tackling debt based on its unique economic environment and political landscape. Let's take Iceland. Allowing banks to collapse was bold, right? But it marked a clear endpoint to their crisis, letting them reset economically without prolonged drag from failing financial institutions. However, trying something like that in a larger economy or one where the banking sector is deeply intertwined with everyday business could be catastrophic. And looking at Argentina, restructuring debt has been their go-to move, but it also led to repeated cycles of crisis and restructuring. It's not just about stretching chores over the week. Sometimes it means you end up doing the same chores over and over if underlying problems aren't resolved. So while flexibility and creativity are key, it's also about sustainable changes that address root causes, from economic policy to regulatory oversight. What we need might be a hybrid approach, blending individual strategies tailored to each nation with globally coordinated efforts to buffer against future shocks. What do you think? Does combining local customization with global coordination sound feasible, or am I just spinning the windmill here?
Oh, Joe, mixing up local fixes with global teamwork sounds like trying to choreograph a dance between an elephant and a ballet dancer. But honestly, it might just be the kind of bold mashup we need to keep the economic engines running smoothly without tripping over our own feet. What's your take on pulling off that dance?
Ha, Simon, putting it like that sure paints a picture. Imagine those dance practice sessions. But you're right, combining these different scales of problem solving could be the secret sauce to global economic stability. All about finding that rhythm, huh?
Uh, totally, Joe. If we dig a bit deeper into that dance analogy, staying on beat with economic policies requires some nifty footwork, right? It's all about timing and coordination, like knowing when to dip and when to twirl. Take Iceland again. They ramped up their tourism, which was like a fresh track that helped them find a new rhythm economically after their financial system kind of crashed the party. By capitalizing on natural beauty and clever marketing, they pulled in cash that wasn't just tied to the old banking tunes. And then there's Argentina, consistently remixing its debt strategies, trying to keep pace with global markets while also doing a solo on domestic reforms. Lots of choreography involved there. So finding this balance between local adjustments and syncing up with international standards isn't just helpful, it's crucial to avoid stepping on toes. Think we could see more countries taking these kinds of coordinated yet personalized approaches post-crisis in the future?
Yeah, Simon, it's fascinating to consider more countries adopting these tailored approaches. But there's always the flip side, right? These strategies, like banking on tourism or constantly rejigging debt terms, come with their own shuffle of risks. Like with Iceland, leaning heavily on tourism turned out well, but what happens when global travel hits a snag like we saw with the pandemic? Suddenly the music stops and you're left scrambling for a new tune. And Argentina, they've been remixing that debt strategy quite a bit. Yeah, but it's like they're stuck on repeat sometimes. The solo gets tiring, and investors might start tuning out if they sense just another remix instead of a new track. So while this dance between local maneuvers and global coordination can be key, it also requires understanding and mitigating the risks involved with those choices. Over-reliance on a single sector or strategy could leave an economy vulnerable. Diversification might be a crucial step in the choreography, don't you think? What's your take, Simon? Can countries keep up with this dynamic routine without tripping over their own legacy issues? Or is there a need to, maybe broaden the playbook a bit more?
Oh, spot on, Joe. Diversification is like having a killer playlist, so if one tune flops, you've still got the party jumping. It's all about not putting all your eggs in one basket, or all your dancers on one stage, right? Keeping the show diverse and dynamic could really keep those economic legs nimble. What wild card do you think could spice up the global economic dance floor next?
Oh, how about this wild card? Virtual economies. Imagine if countries start leveraging digital currency and online platforms as a major part of their GDP. It's like adding a disco ball to the economic dance floor. Totally transforms the scene.
Virtual economies, Joe. That's like leveling up in a massive multiplayer game, but with real stakes. Turning bits and bytes into bucks could seriously shuffle the deck. But I gotta ask, how do we make sure this digital dance doesn't trip over its own techie feet? Like ensuring cybersecurity and fair access. It's a tall order, right?
Uh, Absolutely, Simon. The stakes are sky high with virtual economies. Look, diving into something like digital currency or online platforms can seriously pump up a nation's economic game. But The catch is in making sure it doesn't turn into a hacker's paradise or leave some folks stuck on the sidelines without access. So cybersecurity becomes mega important. Like we're talking about building Fort Knox for data protection here. And on top of that, ensuring everyone's got a ticket to this dance means ramping up internet infrastructure and making digital literacy as common as, knowing how to tie your shoes. But let's not forget, we need solid regulations that move as fast as the technology does, or else we'll just be playing tech catch-up while dealing with all sorts of unintended missteps. It's not just about making the economy bigger, it's about making it secure and inclusive too. What do you think? Simon, are we ready for that kind of complex choreography, or are these moves just too advanced for our current setup?
Oh, Joe, gearing up for this high-tech hoedown means stepping up in a lot of ways. Even the best dancers need rehearsal, right? Whether we're jackpot ready or just dream chasing, diving into digital economies sure does open up a sprawling field of what ifs, and let's try that. So, flipping the script, we got to ask ourselves, what are the other wild cards that could reshape our economic landscape post-crisis? Always more to explore, huh?
Absolutely, Simon. Speaking of what ifs and adventurous paths post-crisis, let's pivot to something unexpected yet intriguing, like how cultural fabric can actually play a role in economic strategies. Take Iceland, for instance. Beyond their financial maneuvers, there's this fascinating layer of their folk tales about elves and hidden people. Sounds whimsical, right? But this deep-rooted folklore might have more to do with their economic resilience than we might initially think. Let's dive into how those mythical narratives could influence real-world recovery. What's your take on mixing myth with economic method?
Oh, Joe, diving into that mix of myth and money, it's like baking a cake with a secret ingredient that nobody expects, but somehow it just works. This reminds me of a trip I took to Iceland a few years back, a spectacular place. While I was there, I actually went on this guided tour about elves and hidden people. And our guide was so into it, talking with such passion and belief, it was infectious. What struck me was how these tales weren't just old stories. They felt alive, woven into the fabric of, well, everything. From preserving nature spots to influencing local development plans, these beliefs kind of guide economic decisions in subtle ways. The locals' connection to their folklore seemed to boost their morale and bond them stronger as a community. It felt like these stories gave them a collective strength. It got me thinking. This profound cultural identity can really act as a cushion in tough times. Like during the financial crisis, this underlying strength may be offered both comfort and a rallying point. What do you think, Joe? Can the power of shared myths and legends really help pull a whole economy up by its bootstraps, or am I just getting caught up in the fairy tale?
Oh, Simon, it's like you've stumbled onto a magical recipe here. You're not just caught up in fairy tales. The power of these stories could be as real as it gets when rallying a nation.
But, Joe, playing devil's advocate here, there's another side to this. While these myths may boost morale and unity, leaning too hard on cultural tales could muddle realistic policymaking. Think about it. If decisions are overly influenced by folklore, that might sidestep practicality or modern economic theories, which are, crucial for real-world applications. And there's the risk of alienating external investors who might not quite get the local lore. They could see it as a lack of seriousness or predictability in governance, leading to hesitancy in pumping funds into the economy. It's while these stories are magical and all, they need to be balanced with clear, rational economic strategies that everyone, locals and outsiders, can buy into. What's your take on finding that balance, Joe?
Simon, you've definitely hit on a crucial tightrope walk here. Mixing folklore with modern governance indeed demands a delicate balance. We can't just sprinkle in some elf dust and expect economic miracles. But look at it this way. These stories might actually have subtle strengths. Think of them as a kind of cultural branding, right? It's like Iceland has cast itself into a unique niche that captivates tourists and inspires local pride, which is economically beneficial. Yet, respecting the dance between lore and real-world policies is key. They've managed to engage globally as a distinctive, fascinating locale without tumbling into fairy tale whimsy where it counts, in their financial dealings. But yes, there's always that potential pitfall of becoming too inward-looking or eccentric for international investors and partners. Keeping a firm footing in globally understood and respected economic practices while using those tales as, let's say, seasoning rather than the main ingredient could be the sweet spot. Finding equilibrium, that's the challenge, isn't it? How do we keep global standards while embracing what makes local culture special without crossing over into impracticality? What do you see as potential safeguards or strategies to maintain that balance, Simon?
Oh, wow, Joe. Imagine if other countries started branding their unique cultural quirks like Iceland, say Scotland leveraging Nessie, or Egypt playing up pharaohs and mummies. Could be a whole new world of economic strategy mixing lore with the ledger books. What wild local legend would you pick to boost an economy, huh?
Ha, Simon. Imagine leveraging Bigfoot out here in the Pacific Northwest. Merch, tourism, maybe an eco-preserve. There's a gold mine in those woods, mythical or not. What's next on our mystical economic tour?
Oh, Joe, Bigfoot as an economic booster? Now that's a wild pitch. But diving back into the Iceland thing, it's like they've crafted this epic saga where everyone's on board, right? The elves and hidden people become more than just tales. They're part of the national identity. This unity and pride can really galvanize folks during tough times. But here's what I think is like critical to making sure folklore doesn't steer things off the practical path. Education and transparency. Ensuring that the general public and international players understand the charming blend of myth with savvy economic planning. That's key. By educating both locals and foreigners on how these cultural elements influence more than just tourism, but also contribute to societal cohesion and resilience, it kind of lays down a clear map of the terrain everyone's navigating. Transparency about how decisions are made, showing that there's solid reasoning and modern economic thinking behind the mystical veneer. It reassures investors and stakeholders that there's a steady hand on the tiller. So, while the myths sparkle on the surface, the gears underneath work in concert with global standards. How do you see this education and transparency playing out, Joe? Do you think it's enough to keep the lore alive without compromising on robust economic frameworks?
Oh, absolutely, Simon. You nailed it. Education and transparency are indeed the anchor keeping that mystical ship steady. By striking this balance, folks can embrace those enchanting tales while still navigating through today's global economic waters adeptly. And speaking of tales, we've got to wrap up today's chapter of our podcast journey. Huge thanks to all our listeners for tuning in to Infinite Podcast and getting deep into the myths and money with us. Remember, keep that spark alive, dive into discussions, and make sure you join us back here tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern for more explorations. Until then, keep pondering the mysteries, both mythical and economic.